Chapter 39 is the final chapter of the first major chunk of Isaiah and the end of the narrative about Hezekiah. We saw in the video on chapter 21 that this episode, even though it is to do with Babylon, has the fearsome Assyria in the background. Merodach Baladan was king of Babylon twice, and this delegation from him is probably during his second reign. He is likely hoping Judah will either join him in the revolt against Assyria or is still committed to it, despite the fears for Hezekiah's health. Isaiah may have been deliberately kept out of the loop here to stop him interfering or doing something embarrassing. He asks about the identity of these men and their purpose and what they were shown. And we have to guess whether he genuinely doesn't know or whether he is setting Hezekiah up to hear the message which Isaiah has already been told. Why does Hezekiah think this is a good message from God? Does he think that this prediction implies that Babylon will win this present venture against Assyria? Whatever the case, no doom is ordained for him personally, and so Hezekiah is relieved. The second major chunk of Isaiah begins then with chapter 40. The rest of Isaiah can be broken down into three sections, the first being chapters 40 to 48. This first section emphasizes God's uniqueness. Part of this uniqueness is shown in how God is the only one who knows the future, who understands what is happening in all the tumultuous events of history, because of course these are his plans, which are inexorably unfolding. The main difference between this second major chunk and the first is the time on which the prophecies focus. In the first, it has been the late 8th century, and the enemy has been Assyria. Now attention moves to the second half of the 6th century, and the enemy is Babylon. The visions move beyond the prediction that Judah would go into exile. They speak to a people who have already endured this punishment, and indeed endured it long enough, so that now God speaks a message of comfort to his people. In verse 1, the Lord issues the command to comfort his people. The verbs comfort plus speak and call in verse 2 are in the second person plural, meaning that they are addressed not to Isaiah only, or perhaps not at all, but to the heavenly court. This recalls the throne room commission of chapter 6, and also the vision which Micaiah has in 1 Kings 22. Perhaps we should imagine that here Isaiah has been granted another vision of the divine council and overhears the Lord's new decree given out to the angels. The message is that the penalty has been paid, and then some. No more is expected. Now is the time for renewal and restoration. Verses 3 to 5 repeat the promise made in chapter 35 of a highway out of Babylon. It is verse 3 in particular, though, which is important, as it is the verse quoted by all the evangelists regarding John the Baptist. But who is the voice here in verse 3, who again speaks in chapter 6? Verse 6. It is not God speaking now, because the voice speaks about making preparations for God. It is the mouth of Yahweh, as identified in verse 5. This is the highest rank in a kingdom. In Egypt, Pharaoh's vizier was the mouth of the king. Jeremiah is also the mouth of the Lord in Jeremiah 1:9 and 15:19. Aaron is the mouth of Moses in Exodus 4:16. In this position, the person speaks directly for the king. The next few verses are taken up by Peter in his first letter, who quotes from verse 6 and then 8 in 1 Peter 1. Verse 6 now issues a command in the singular, and the response is singular. And I said, "What shall I cry?" The message found in verse 9 is, "Here is your God." The Lord comes as a shepherd in verse 11 to feed, to gather, to carry, and to lead. In verse 9, the herald of good news is mentioned twice. In the Greek translation, this is the verbal form of the word translated gospel. What follows in this chapter is a sort of declaration of the unique might of God. The repeated question of who in verses 12 to 14 emphasizes that it is God alone who does these things, who is capable of doing these things. Verses 13 to 14 are quoted by Paul in Romans 11:34. Verse 25 brings this thought out most clearly. To whom then will you compare me, or who is my equal, says the Holy One. Note also here the characteristic use of the title Holy One for Yahweh in Isaiah. Now in verse 27 does the point emerge. The exiles have felt abandoned. Their way is hidden from God, they say. But in the final verses of this chapter, the Lord assures them that in this oracle that he himself is everlasting and cannot be fatigued or made to give up. It is he who strengthens those who are weak and who are exhausted. The exiles need only wait patiently, and the Lord will renew their strength.